Hi, and welcome to the third lecture on the history of biology. In this lecture, I will talk about evolution. I will tell you the story of Darwin's life and his big voyage on the Beagle around the world, and the origin of his ideas of evolution. But I will also explain a little bit more about how Darwin fits in the 19th century, about how the Beagle project was part of the imperial project of the British Empire, and how his ideas were influenced by ideas of economists and political scientists of the 19th century, and in turn influenced a lot of the thinking in the later 19th century, and actually up until this day. But before I want to talk about evolution, I want to briefly recapitulate the topic of the last lecture, Lecture 2, the taxonomical style in biology. I tried to show how the taxonomic style of biology has roots in curiosity cabinets, these bizarre collections of rich people who collected whatever they found to show off their connoisseurship of biology, of art and books. And apart from this, these curiosity cabinets, there was also another route for the taxonomic style in biology, which is botanic gardens. From the 16th century, but especially in the 17th century, botanic gardens were important places where new medicines were developed, where herbs were grown, but increasingly also afterwards, people started to collect food crops such as potatoes or tomatoes and to spread them to the colonies and into their agricultural system. And also for horticultural purposes, these botanic gardens were very important, for example, for growing and distributing tulips. So I showed how with these building blocks, important botanists and biologists, taxonomists, for example, like Linnaeus, then use these collections to try and find a systematic way of structuring the collections, of understanding the structure in nature. In Linnaeus' case, one might even say impose a bit of structure on nature. A wonderful hero of the taxonomic style. Now, the taxonomic style, as I showed, gradually disappeared from dominance in biology, and by the end of the 19th century, other ways of doing biology became much more important, such as laboratories, which I'll talk about later. However, these collections were kept and maintained, actually many of them until this day, and still perform a role in some parts of biology, and they are kept and well guarded in wonderful places such as the London Natural History Museum. So far, the taxonomic style. Out of that taxonomic style also came people like Darwin modifying the taxonomic style into something new, and I'll talk about that this week. So first, I'll explain a little bit about change and ideas of change in nature and society by the early 19th century. Then I'll talk about where Darwin got his ideas from, the voyage of the Beagle and the origin of species. Then about his fame, why did he become so famous, how did he become famous, and maybe the fact that he became a little bit more famous than he deserved. Then Darwin's mission, the things that motivated him, the ideas he wanted to distribute throughout the world. And then later on also I'll explain a little bit more about metaphors in Darwin's work and what these metaphors did, where he got them from, and the significance of them. And then lastly, in the last section of this lecture, I'll explain a little bit about the meaning of Darwin, the impact of Darwin, how his ideas were taken up, altered, and used for all kinds of purposes. But that's for much later. Now first, it is time to talk about change, ideas about change, somewhere around the beginning of the 19th century. Now, generally, throughout the Middle Ages especially, the dominant view of change in nature was a static one. This meant that the way what nature looked like was basically the same as what God had created, and this divine structure in nature had a hierarchical shape. As I already showed last lecture, with the ladder of nature, there was a very clear distinction between higher and lower organisms, and you couldn't go from one rung of this ladder to the next one. Now, of course, people knew that animals and plants and dogs and horses and all that can change because they've been breeding them for a very long time, trying to change what they look like. So people knew very well, in fact, and already knew about 9000 BC that you could breed and change, alter what, for example, a dog looks like. Nevertheless, a dog will always just be a dog and is stuck in this species box of dogness. So a dog cannot change, cannot evolve into something else. So fundamentally, the view of nature was very static. The only way that nature actually could change and be altered was in dramatic ways. So for example, here you've got the wonderful painting of the deluge. So by these kinds of dramatic, catastrophic, divine interventions, the face of the earth could change. But those were the only kinds of change that were acceptable. Apart from that, nature was seen as something fairly stable, just like society was seen as something relatively stable. Now, for this worldview of a stable, unaltering nature, there were a couple of problems. And one of the problems were fossils. Now, fossils have been known for hundreds of years and collected for hundreds of years. Here you see a picture of fossils drawn by James Hook, for example, Robert Hooke, in 1703. Around 1500 already, Leonardo da Vinci found fossils, and in fact he found fossils, marine fossils, shells, high up in the Apennine Mountains. Not only that, but he found fossils of extinct species that no longer existed, and he also found fossils layered high up in the mountains, suggesting, different layers, suggesting that one flood, one deluge, one biblical flood could not explain why these things were there. And to try and match it all, Leonardo said, well, because we find shells like that, we probably missed a deluge. There's probably more deluges, more biblical floods that can explain why there are layers high up in the mountains in the Apennines. So he tried to match it into his worldview. He tried to find ways to make the dominant worldview at that point fit with things he observed. So the question then was, these old shells, these old fossils, what are they? How are they generated? Are they really extinct species? Is it possible that so many times species got extinct by catastrophic events? Was there mass extinction, and were there several waves of mass extinction? How is it possible that these animals seem to fit their environment? How does that work? Is all this the work of divine intervention, or are there other theories that we could use to understand what's happening here? Adaptation processes, for example. So with fossils and with this idea of mass extinction, people try to fit data into their theories, try and hold on to their theories. Now you can compare this with the work of Galen from the first lecture, where also in the centuries afterwards, and especially in the Renaissance, people twisted the information a little bit to make it fit into Galen's view of the human body. Right? So it's the same kind of process at work here. The third thing that generated problems was a number of experiments that tried to figure out how old the Earth was. Now, according to the Bible, and this was figured out by a bishop called James Ussher, who at a certain point towards the second half of the 17th century went through the Bible and calculated exactly how long every generation took, added it all up. So if Sarah became 140 years old, her and her father, generation to generation, added it all up, he then deduced that the Earth must be about 6,000 years old. In fact, he felt so confident about being able to calculate the age of the world that he could decide, he figured out that the world was created on the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. Quite precise. Now, the experiments I mentioned were performed, for example, by Buffon, the great French biologist, who, towards the end of the 18th century, tried to figure out how long it took for a cannonball to cool down. If you make a cannonball until it's red hot, assuming that the world at some point was red hot too, and you then let the cannonball cool down, you can extrapolate how long a much bigger shape, such as the Earth, would take to cool down to its present state. Now, from this experiment, he deduced that the Earth had to be at least 75,000 years old, which from today's perspective may seem a little bit silly, but in his time, extending from 60,000 years to 75,000 years was already a quite dramatic reinterpretation of the age of Earth. Now, debates about the age of the Earth were also going on at this time between geologists. Some geologists believed that the Earth was formed gradually by, for example, processes of sedimentation, while others said no, the Earth was formed by dramatic events such as volcanic eruptions. And these two schools in geology fought a lot between each other. The one school, the one who said it's all formed by sedimentation, by gradual process, were called uniformitarianists, because they thought that the Earth would form in uniform, stable processes that would be the same throughout history. Sedimentation, deposition, slow, gradual processes. The people who believed in catastrophes and cataclysmic change thought that the history of Earth would be full of deluges, massive floods, cataclysmic volcanic eruptions, and similar events. Now, if you believe that these kinds of cataclysmic events shape the Earth, then the Earth can be a lot younger. The history of the Earth can be a lot shorter because a lot of change can happen in a shorter period of time. And so the uniformitarians thought that the Earth was a lot older. Now, you see here a picture of the book by Charles Lyell, the geologist of the early 19th century and an important uniformitarianist who described geological processes, new insights in geological processes. And it's uniformitist theories like this that influenced Darwin a lot initially in its early phase of his thinking, because this creates a longer history of the Earth in which more gradual change in biology is possible too. Right, so far change, dominant until the 19th century, a static view of nature. If you are a dog will remain a dog even if it becomes a different kind of dog. So yes, you have breeding, but basically the essence of the dog remains the dog. And then gradually you see problems for this worldview that are initially still squeezed in, but the evidence starts to accumulate. There's fossils, there's layers of fossils in the mountains. There's new theories about how old the Earth could be, and new insights from geology, and all of that accumulates by the early 19th century and sets the stage for people like Darwin. Okay, that much about change. Maybe now you want to take some time to answer a few questions to see whether you've understood what I've just explained.